my talk this evening is going to be on pilgrimage to India. And the reason for that is because I just came back from a pilgrimage to India, so I'm now feeling inspired and ready to talk about it. I went with a Singaporean group of 57 people, came back on Monday from India. So my idea was to share some of the, maybe not actually the direct experiences, but maybe share some of the thoughts about what the purpose of pilgrimage is all about, what we can expect to get out of this sort of pilgrimage. I assume that many of you probably have already been on this sort of pilgrimage, and those of you who haven't been on pilgrimage, maybe an opportunity to learn something more about it, and maybe it will inspire you to do this sort of thing in the future. So the first thing I want to talk about pilgrimage is basically why was it, what is the background for this sort of pilgrimage? What is the reason that we do pilgrimage in the first place? And I know that the beautiful thing about Buddhism is that there is a very good reason why we do these things. And that reason is that it was actually laid down by the Buddha 2,500 years ago, that this is a very good idea to go to those places where the Buddha actually was staying 2,500 years ago. And because it was laid down by the Buddha, because he actually recommended this sort of thing, there is a powerful authority there to go on this sort of pilgrimage. There's a powerful reason why this is a good idea. Presumably, we can assume that the Buddha wouldn't have said so if it wasn't a good idea. So in Buddhism, there is a very kind of authoritative statement behind the reason why we do this sort of thing. And the Buddha said specifically, the 4 places that we should go to are the places where the Buddha was born, where he got enlightened, where he preached the first sermon, and where he entered Parinibbana, in other words, where he died, passed away at the end of his career. So what is the rationale for the Buddha to lay down this? Why did he lay down this idea that we should go out and go to these places? Obviously there must have been a reason for this. The Buddha doesn't do things without reason. And the story in the sutras, as we can read them today, basically this is all found in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which is basically the sutta about Buddha's last kind of long walk or trip, which eventually led to the place where he attained Parinibbana. And this walk starts off in Rajagaha. Rajagaha is the ancient capital of the Magadhan Republic in India. Magadha was at the time of the Buddha's end of his life. This was the strongest kingdom in India at that time. So it was a very powerful state. And after the Buddha passed away, this Magadha actually grew into a very, very powerful kingdom in India. And eventually it became to basically encompass all of what is known as India today, and even more. It also included large parts of Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asia, places which today are part of China, for example. And it was an enormous, enormous kingdom. This was Magadha, and it was centered in Pataliputra, Patna, which is close to Rajagaha. But in the days of the Buddha, it was Rajagaha which was the capital of this kingdom, which eventually was going to be the most powerful one in all of Indian history, basically. So the Buddha set out from there, and he walks north, and he walks through Patna, which then became later on the capital of this republic, crossed the river Ganges, and then came to Vesali. Vesali was one of the other very large cities in India at that time. It was a very powerful place as well. Now in Vesali, this is the place where the Buddha spent his last rains retreat. You may have heard about these rains retreats. It is basically a place where the monks stay still, don't go anywhere for 3 months, basically just practicing meditation and talking about Dhamma and such things. So this was the Buddha's last rains retreat in Vesali. And of course he stayed put in this place. And one of the things that happened during this rains retreat was that the Buddha got extremely ill, really, really ill. And of course, the Buddha was getting very old at this stage. He was basically 80 years old. His body was starting to fall apart. There's a famous phrase in the sutta where the Buddha says that my body is like an old cart. It's as if it's held together by straps, in the same way that an old cart is held together by straps. I've come to the last stage of my life. This is what the Buddha says. And of course it's to be expected that when anybody, including the Buddha, comes to the last stage of their life, they will get ill, they will get sick. This is what happens to all of us. And so it happens with the Buddha, and it's a very, very severe illness. And when this happens, his loyal lieutenant or attendant, Venerable Ananda, gets very upset and he gets very confused because he reckons that the Buddha, this shouldn't happen to the Buddha, or at least the Buddha should say something to the Sangha and to the people around him before he passes away. And Ananda, after the Buddha has come out of his sickness, he goes to the Buddha and says to him, while you were sick, Lord, it was as if my body was drugged. I couldn't get a bearing on the directions. I couldn't even remember the Dhamma. That's how bad I was feeling at the time. And the Buddha, of course, he says to Venerable Ananda, of course, the ordinary things that, of course, why should we be sad? Why should we be confused about this? This is the nature of reality. Whatever has come into being must also pass away. The physical body of the Buddha, of course, death has to happen at some stage, and illness. But the powerful thing here, of course, is that we see that Venerable Ananda, who was a Sotapanna, a stream mentor at the time, the Sotapanna is somebody who has seen the Dhamma of the Buddha, somebody who has understood the teachings, and somebody who understands what they're all about. But even such a person is not yet fully enlightened, but on the way to full enlightenment. Even such a person grieves and gets very sad when the Buddha is about to pass away. This is very powerful. This is amazing that even a person of that sort of level of wisdom and insight can actually grieve and be sad about it. This shows us how profound this particular thing is when the Buddha passes away from the world. And indeed later on, when the Buddha lies down between the famous two sal trees in Kusinara, where he eventually passes away, then there are lots of people grieving. You see people coming from everywhere, not only people, also devas. Devas are these godly beings in Buddhism. They're not actually gods in the ordinary sense of the word. They're gods only in the sense that they are very powerful beings with lots of happiness and long lives, etc. But they don't have the ordinary powers of gods that we normally associate with other religions. In that sense, they're very different. So all these beings come and they cry and they grieve, and the Buddha is passing away. What a terrible, terrible thing is happening to the world. And you can see why is this happening? Why are people so sad? And if you think about who the Buddha actually is, you will understand why this is such a terrible event for people who are not yet enlightened, who are seeking to actually find freedom from suffering for themselves, finding that peace inside, which the Buddha promised is available to each one of us. Because the Buddha was the wisest person around. He had full understanding of happiness and suffering in the world. He had full understanding how we can all gain that happiness in the world and free ourselves from that suffering. Because he had that full understanding of these things, he was able to advise us in the absolute best possible way how to overcome these things. Imagine, it's a bit like having a father who has, or a mother for that matter, who has supreme wisdom and can always guide us in the right direction, always guide us to what is for our own benefit. Imagine that. Imagine having that sort of person in your life. And not only that, but also having supreme compassion and loving kindness for us, always giving us advice in the best possible way, in the most beautiful kind of way, always having that kindness, having that coming from a good place inside, never angry, never upset. So when you start to imagine such a person in the world, you start to see why beings were so attached to the Buddha, why even stream mentors, people who were not fully enlightened yet, why even they actually had that attachment there. So this becomes then the powerful reason why this is happening here. And one of the things that all these beings are saying as they're seeing the Buddha pass away, they're saying too soon the Buddha is passing away from the world. Too soon the eye of the world is disappearing here. And this idea of the eye of the world disappearing is actually a very profound and interesting statement. Why is the Buddha the eye of the world? The Buddha is the eye of the world because he has seen reality as it actually is, right? He has seen rebirth, he has understood karma, he has understood the end of all suffering. In other words, he has understood all those truths which really matter for human beings. What matters for us is finding of happiness and ending of suffering. It's what we're all searching for here. And here is the Supreme Being who has found these to the utmost extent. So it means that he has seen these things. He has seen things which most of us never can see. We cannot see these things unless we're guided by somebody else. And because the Buddha has seen these things and he shows us to the rest of us, that is why he is called the eye of the world. It's as if he's seeing for us and then telling us what it actually is like on the other side, We're all walking around in darkness, as if we're dreaming, not really seeing reality as it actually is. And then somebody comes along and says, this is the way it is. And that gives you the opportunity for you also to see the reality of things. So the Buddha is the eye of the world. So that is why we have all this grieving and all this sadness at the Buddha's enlightenment. Of course, not enlightenment, sorry, at the Buddha's passing away. The enlightenment, of course, is the opposite. Of course, the only person who probably is quite happy is the Buddha, because the Buddha has had to carry around this body and these five senses, which is, the body is still painful, the five senses are still a nuisance because it stops you often from attaining deep samadhi, it's a disturbance. So the Buddha himself is probably quite pleased at finally being able to attain parinibbana. It's just everybody else who is sad. Of course, the fully enlightened beings, the arahats also, are not sad because they have understood how these things are. So then the Buddha realizes, of course, that this is a problem, and the Venerable Ananda goes to the Buddha and says, well, what shall we do now in the future when we want to pay our respects to the Buddha? You have all these monks who always want to come, and nuns who want to come their respects to the Buddha. How shall we go about doing this? You're about to pass away. And the Buddha says, what you should do is that instead of seeing me, you should go to these four places in the world. The place where the Tathagata, in other words, the Buddha was born, where he was enlightened, where he preached his first sermon, and where he is passing away in final nibbana. These are the four places you should go. And when you go to these four places, you will feel, people who have faith in the Buddha, they will feel emotions when they go to these places. Something will happen inside of you which makes this trip, this going to these places, something special for you. It will be as if, in a sense, you are seeing the Buddha, even though he is not actually physically present. And not only that, the Buddha also said that if you do this, what will happen is that if you are a person of faith and you go on this sort of tour and you actually die while doing it, he said that you are secured a rebirth in a heavenly realm because of all those good qualities which arise in you when you go on this kind of tour. So this then we can see now the rationale for why the Buddha laid down this thing. The world was crying, the world was feeling that there's an emptiness, something left behind it, and he was trying to put something in place which could be like a replacement for the Buddha. Of course, there's something else also which is a replacement for the Buddha, which is much more important. That, of course, is the Dhamma, because the Buddha himself is nothing really more than actually the Dhamma. The Dhamma and the Buddha are basically equivalent. The Buddha's enlightenment is the understanding of his teachings, and his teaching are nothing more than the expression of that enlightenment. And he has taught that openly and freely. So when you read the Dhamma, you're also, in a sense, seeing who the Buddha was. These two are like two sides of the same coin. And because the Buddha has expressed that Dhamma fully and completely, it was available to people, there wasn't really any more need for the Buddha to remain in the world. The Dhamma was there already. This is the other thing the Buddha said, of course, to make people feel at ease and not so sad about his departure. So this then is the rationale that the Buddha laid down just before he passed away, and said this is what we should all be doing. And of course, again, the authority there is then very powerful, and it becomes something that we all should consider seriously if we're Buddhists. That this might be something that we should do in our lives. So the Buddha having laid this down, then of course the next thing which happened was that people, after the Buddha died, people started doing these kind of pilgrimages and going to these holy sites. And I want to talk a little bit about those people who actually have historically done this kind of pilgrimage, because it's quite inspiring to see the kind of personalities and how they went about doing these kind of pilgrimages. And the first historical person that we all know about, definitely did this kind of pilgrimage, was the Emperor Ashoka. Many of you have probably heard about Ashoka. Ashoka was as I said before, the greatest emperor probably in Indian history. He was ruling this massive Indian empire, which is larger than even India is today. An extremely powerful man. And he was a Buddhist. So he's probably the most powerful Buddhist that has ever existed in our universe. And he lived about 150 years after the Buddha. And after he became a Buddhist, he of course did precisely this kind of pilgrimage, which we're all supposed to do. And one of the nice things that he did when he went on this pilgrimage, he erected these famous Ashokan pillars in many of these places. These Ashokan pillars are like stone columns, and these stone columns have carvings on them, all kinds of carvings. But the ones that were done on the 4 holy sites, if you like, they often had carvings about, like, this is the birthplace of the Buddha, for example. The Buddha was born here, and then something more in addition to that. And this is one of the ways that we can actually find these Buddhist sites, because of these Ashokan pillars that were placed in those places 2,300 years ago. Not long after the Buddha, 150 years after the Buddha, it's still quite recent. So Ashoka did this pilgrimage, went around the places, and lots of the very earliest archaeological evidence which exists to this day is particularly from the time of Ashoka, when he went around. So there already is one powerful example for us of what sort of people actually did these kind of pilgrimages. In the early days, most of the people who went on these pilgrimages were obviously Indian people from around India, because that was the only part of the world which was Buddhist at this time. But slowly, of course, it started to expand, and other countries also became Buddhist. First Buddhist country after India was Sri Lanka, and there's lots of inscriptions found to this day of Sri Lankans who went to the holy sites and saying, I came here, I did such and such an offering in the name of such and such a relative, and you find these kind of inscriptions all over the place. So obviously there was lots and lots and lots of pilgrims which came to these holy sites. The next part of the history of pilgrimages is the history of Chinese monks coming to India. And there are some very, very famous Chinese monks that came all the way from China all the way to India. And it was an incredibly arduous journey in those days to travel from China. They traveled from what was the capital of China in those days, Xi'an. I think that's how we pronounce it, but I may have gotten that wrong here. And they traveled then westwards along the Silk Road. And if any of you have studied the map of what it looks like in those areas, it is extremely isolated and of course much, much worse 1,500, 2,000 years ago than it is today. It's all very high altitude, deserts, snow, cold winds and all these things. And then, having traversed all those deserts, then you have to cross these enormous mountains at the other end, either the Himalaya mountains or the Hindu Kush, depending a bit on which route you take. And then, after only having crossed those mountains, do you actually enter India proper. There's about 2,000 kilometers of travel there, and the landscape is incredibly barren and very difficult to cross. And lots of these Chinese monks died on the way. They died. That's how keen they were to go on this pilgrimage. They couldn't handle it, died of altitude sickness, of cold, all kind of things, and never, of course, made it back again to China. The first one, and when they went, of course, because the journey was so arduous, they went for usually very long periods of time. The most famous Chinese monk to go to India is a monk called Xuan Zang. He stayed, his journey lasted for 17 years. 17 years. So imagine what sort of pilgrimage that was, 17 years away. It's quite staggering. And he went with the blessing of the Emperor of China, because the Emperor of China in those days was also a Buddhist. So again, you can see that these were very high-level kind of pilgrimages going on in those days. And Xuan Zang went to China. The reason why many of these monks went to China in those days was twofold, basically. First of all, they wanted to go to the holy sites, to pay their respects there, to get a feeling for Buddhism in its original land, just like most pilgrims do today. That was obviously one very important reason. And the other reason why they went, and that was to actually collect the Buddhist scriptures. Because in those days, India was still the Buddhist homeland, and if you wanted to find original Buddhist scriptures, you had to travel to India in those days. In China, there were already many translations into Chinese, but often, just like today, those translations may not have been so good, maybe not so accurate. So people wanted to go back to the homeland of Buddhism to find the original, the real teachings of Buddhism, just in the same way as we are today, always searching for what actually did the Buddha teach, what are the original teachings. So these Chinese monks collected enormous amounts of rolls of scriptures and then brought them back to China and spent decades translating all these Indian Sanskrit languages into Chinese. And it's interesting because it's a precedent we can see today in today's world. You will find that many monks, particularly monks but also academics, are extremely interested in this question: what actually did the Buddha teach? Who was the Buddha? What are his true teachings? Because obviously this is very important. If we know what the Buddha taught, well, that is the teaching which has real authority in Buddhism. What anybody else says, okay, that's fine, maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, we can't really tell. But the Buddha, we have to assume that his teachings were right. So these are the real authoritative teachings, and that is why it is so important to try to base our practice on the authority of the Buddha himself. And you can see how this search has been going on basically ever since the Buddha passed away. It's always been the search for, well, what did the Buddha actually teach? So these Chinese monks went to India, and there's some beautiful descriptions of these Chinese monks going to India. There's one famous monk called Fa Xian, and he was one of the first ones to go to India, and he went to Savatthi, where the Buddha spent most of his time. And they wrote books, so we know exactly what they felt and what happened to them when they went to these places. And when he went to Savatthi, he was the first Chinese monk to go there. And all these Indian monks were marveling at this foreigner among them, this strange person who come 2,000 kilometers away just to come to Savatthi, just to come to India, to experience what it's like to be in the Buddhist land. And the Chinese monk, of course, were also marveling at all the strange customs around them. And the Chinese monks were saying, and they were getting very emotional and crying, that, why is it that we were born so far away from the Buddhist land? Why is it that we were born in a different time from the time of the Buddha? And they were obviously very emotional about being able to come to the places where the Buddha had been in those days. So very beautiful descriptions you can find in some of these books, and some of these books are still available today. They're translated into English, and you can read them yourself, these descriptions of these Chinese monks 1,500, 1,600 years ago. So after these Chinese monks went to India, as many of them died, that's how arduous those pilgrims were in those days. Some of those Chinese pilgrims also went by the sea route, from China going through the Malacca Straits and across the ocean. Very, very dangerous in those days, just as it can be dangerous today, infested by pirates and all kinds of things. And again, many of them never actually made it to India. They perished on the way. Some of the other pilgrims that have gone to India are from all over the world. You find pilgrims from Vietnam, from Japan, from Korea, later on, well not later on, but also early on from Burma, from Thailand, from Cambodia, from everywhere basically. The whole Buddhist world did pilgrimages from the ancient times to the present day, coming to India. In the present day you find, for example, there's a famous story of a Thai monk, supposedly very good meditator, who walked, it's only about 100 years ago, who walked all the way from Thailand all the way to India, just so that he could visit those 4 holy places in India. Walked all that way. It's about 2,000 kilometers walk. Now you've got to be really, really keen. There's got to be something inside you which tells you this is really important to be able to walk for 2,000 kilometers just to see these historical Buddhist sites. So you can see here the power which draws people, and often these people are people who are very, very serious about their spiritual path, very serious about learning about Buddhism, people who are really find this extremely important to go all this way to India to seek the roots of their religion, so to speak. And if you go to India today, it's one of the things which I found so inspiring when I go to these holy places, that you find people coming from all over the world seeing these places. You find people coming from Taiwan doing their chants in Mandarin, and it's actually it's nice to listen to. I don't understand anything of it, but it's quite nice to listen to it. And you find people coming from China, you find people coming from Vietnam, from Korea, lots of people from Thailand. Thailand is very big on these pilgrimages. You find lots of Sri Lankan people, you find Cambodians, and these days, of course, you also find, for the first time in history, lots of people from the Western world going to these places, holy places in India. So when you go there, it's almost like it's a gathering of Buddhist people from all over the world. And that in itself is actually quite a beautiful experience. Of course, lots of Tibetans as well go there, because the Tibetans are very keen on going to Bodh Gaya. Many of them already live in India. So there's a coming together and a sense of basically meeting lots of Buddhist people everywhere in the world. And that's quite fascinating. Suddenly you feel as if you're part of this enormous Buddhist family which spreads now across the globe, basically to every nook and cranny of this globe. Today you find monks, for example, even in Africa. There are black African monks who take part in some of these ceremonies and things that we sometimes meet. So they are everywhere. Everybody is getting inspired by the Dhamma of the Buddha. So this is just to give you some idea about the history of this pilgrimage and some of the people who have done this sort of pilgrimage in the past. Now the last thing I want to talk about is, well, what can we expect to get out of a pilgrimage? Why should we do it? What is the purpose? What can it do for us, in a sense, this kind of pilgrimages? And the first thing, and a very powerful thing that I've always found with going on a pilgrimage, is that it gives the whole Buddhist teachings, the whole of Buddhism, a very powerful historical reality here. Sometimes I found when I was reading the Buddha's discourses, you read about the Buddha was staying here, Buddha was staying in Rajagaha, Buddha was staying in Savatthi, this and that happened. And sometimes I'm not really sure, is it a fairy tale or is it real? Or sometimes it seems a bit like a fairy tale. It's almost hard sometimes to relate to it. It's a foreign culture 2,500 years ago in a far, far away land. I mean, how can we really relate to that in an easy way? Sometimes it seems very foreign and hard to relate to. So the beautiful thing about going to India is that instead of having that sense of foreignness, which you can get sometimes when you read the discourses of the Buddha, what he said, it brings everything alive. It's like you are going to those places which are described in those suttas, in those discourses by the Buddha. And it's very powerful because you read the suttas and you read place names, right? You read Rajagaha, you read Savatthi, you read about Benares. And then you go to India and you see exactly the same place names. You see they're there. They still have the same names 2,500 years later. And suddenly the inescapable conclusion for you is that these must be historical places. Suddenly it becomes incredibly powerful that these things which you read about in the suttas definitely are historical places. It drives home the point in a way which you can never do by just reading the suttas alone. And it's very, very powerful. Rajagaha, for example, is called today Rajgir, and it's a direct derivation from that original name 2,500 years ago. Benares is called Varanasi, or even Benares, called Varanasi in the suttas. It's obviously exactly the same place as it was 2,500 years ago. You go to a place in Rajagaha it's called the hot springs in the suttas, and the story is in the suttas that when the monks were staying in Rajagaha, they were going bathe in these hot springs because it has a natural heating in these hot springs. So it's very pleasant to bathe there, particularly in the winter time, of course. And you go to the exact same spot today, and what do you find? You find people bathing in these springs, even today, 2,500 years later. And this is one of the amazing things about India. Sometimes you think that India has stood still for 2,500 years. And many things in India obviously have stood still. There hasn't been that much change. And that is why, that you can actually recognize these things, even after 2,500 years. Some years ago, some Japanese investigated, they wanted to investigate these particular hot springs. Why is it that there were hot springs here 2,500 years ago? And they found traces of radioactive elements in the ground, of sulfur in the ground. And of course this was so they could actually prove that these hot springs had existed here for a long, long time in the past. One of my favorite stories about making the history of India come true and make it seem very vivid and as if it actually is a historical reality is when I read in the suttas that one of the places the Buddha says that, well, before I become enlightenment, where I was still living the household life, and the Buddha lived a very privileged life, he had a very pleasant upbringing, and he had always the best food around him, and everything of the best around him. And one of the things he had of course the best kind of clothes which were made by the best kind of cloth. Now where did that best kind of cloth come from? It came from a place called Kasi. Kasi is an alternative name for Benares. So he was wearing Kasi cloth, Benares cloth. That was the best cloth in India at the time. Now if you go to Benares today, the amazing thing is that the best cloth, the most famous cloth in India still comes from Benares. One of those amazing things, this tiny little detail in the suttas, which is almost like mentioned in passing. It could mean anything, it could be a legend, it could be a myth. But it isn't. It's obviously historical reality here, because it still is the case today after 2,500 years. I find it remarkable. I find it it's just like you get this feeling that even the minor details of the suttas are actually very true to their word. And it becomes very kind of very remarkable. And when you travel around all these places, you see it again and again and again. In all these places, you see place names, you see things that you recognize, things that go back 2,500 years. And again, it drives home the point. These are historical realities. The Buddha was a historical personality. He was a man that walked this earth very much like the rest of us 2,500 years ago. There cannot be any doubt anymore that these things are historical realities. And that, of course, makes your faith become so much more powerful. When you realize that these things are true, something inside of you happens which grows that faith. It makes it more powerful, makes it really work. So you can now see why this kind of trip can be so inspiring, why it can lift you up and give you a different understanding of what Buddhism actually is, give you an uplift in your practice, do something for you. So that is the first thing, it's just bringing home the historical reality of Buddhism and the Dhamma and all those places where the Buddha was 2,500 years ago. And the second thing, which is a powerful thing of going to India, is simply that when you go to these places, you can often feel something when you go to these places. And this is what the Buddha was talking about when he laid down that we should go to these places. He said that people who have faith, people who are Buddhists, will have emotions when they go to these places. And you can see that often today. It happens that people go there and they feel a sense of joy, or they start crying again out of joy often. This happens all the time. Certainly on my trip, there was one man who said, "Why is it that I'm crying when I go to these places?" And I said, "It's obvious. It's because you are a Buddhist, and suddenly for the first time you are basically face to face with the Buddha. You're going in his footsteps. You've always been removed from him, and suddenly you are in his place. That's why you're crying. It's an emotional reaction. It's to be expected that these things will happen." And this is the second thing which becomes very beautiful, this emotional reaction that we can have, because these kind of emotional reactions leave an impact, leave something in the mind which we later on can recollect that there was some power to these places. There's something about these places which are special. The reason that they are special is, first of all, if you have a sense of faith in Buddhism, then by going to these places, suddenly you are in a place where you are close to the Buddha, as close as you can get in this present age. So if you have that faith, of course, that gives sense to something inside. You're close to that which you have faith in. That in itself gives rise to an emotional reaction often. The other thing which can give rise to joy is simply the fact that in these places there may also sometimes be powerful beings around, like devas, for example. And sometimes it's a bit like, sometimes you can go into a room and you can feel sometimes the emotion of the person in that room. Maybe somebody is angry or something, or somebody is very peaceful, and you can feel that the whole room has a sense of peace, or a sense of non-peace if the person is upset. In the same way, if powerful beings exist in a particular place, it's almost as if you can tune in sometimes to that effect. When you sit down peacefully, close your eyes and try to meditate, sometimes you can feel a kind of energy in these particular places. Nothing supernatural, it's just the effect of presence of these particular beings. So these are the kind of things that we can hope to experience on these trips. So, then what? Is that all there is to it? Is that what pilgrimage is all about? Is it all about just, getting some hold of history and getting a feeling for the reality of this and getting some emotional reaction? Is that what it's all about? No, this is not what it's all about. This is only like the thing that we do when we go on the pilgrimage itself. The real significance of going on a pilgrimage is not these reactions or these things that we feel when we go there. The real significance of pilgrimage is how it affects our general spiritual practice, our general spiritual journey. You may, of course, say that to go to India is a spiritual journey in its own right, but of course that's not the real spiritual journey. The real spiritual journey that we're all on is a journey of the heart. The journey of the heart which moves towards peace, tranquility, kindness, goodness, loving kindness, compassion, all these beautiful qualities that we're all trying to develop in our life. That is a real spiritual journey. It's an inner journey which every one of us has to undertake on their own. And this is a journey which happens in our daily life every day as we try to practice in the correct way, do what is right, avoid doing what is wrong. This is the daily struggles that we go through in practicing our spiritual path, and slowly but surely it is lifting us up, lifting up our minds, and imbuing ourselves with those qualities as we practice. So this is a real spiritual journey. The thing about going to India is just a kind of help on that journey. And that is how we should view, ultimately that's how we should view the pilgrimage to India, as an aid, as something which helps us on our real spiritual journey in daily life. How does it help us in our real spiritual journey in daily life? Well, just the very fact that these things have become more historical, real for you, just the fact that maybe you have felt something when you go to these places, that already will, when you come back, will have a kind of background, subconscious effect on your life, and already do something for you. Sometimes you may not even be aware of it, but I would say that this always has some sort of background effect, at least for a while after you have been on this pilgrimage, even probably for your whole lifetime. That's one way that this has an effect. Another way that this has an effect is simply that sometimes if you feel a bit uninspired, if you feel like your practice is going a bit difficult, you're not really going so well, you can sometimes just reflect on that pilgrimage and think about those highs and those emotions you had when you went there, and then inspire yourself again but to remember that this is real, this is important, this is historical, these teachings actually do what they're supposed to be doing. And then by inspiring yourself in this way, you can lift yourself up, and you can again improve that spiritual practice which you're trying to uphold in your daily life. And this way, this sort of pilgrimage can actually boost your practice of Buddhism. It can give you a little extra kind of energy, that extra kind of thing which helps you going. These are some of the important things in Buddhism, always finding these little skillful means, these little extra things which give you that extra ability to practice, to do what is right, to do what is good, to make it easier to practice a spiritual path. It's difficult enough. We need all the help we can to practice a spiritual path. It is not easy. I've never met anybody who says it's really, really easy to practice this path moving forward at a tremendous speed. This is incredibly rare. Most people find it difficult. And it is difficult because we're going against the stream of things, always going, practicing against what our natural inclination is. Natural inclination often is craving. And of course we have to go against that, and that's why the practice often is difficult. Now I heard of one girl who went to India. This was an example of how we should be careful about going to India, what we should not be doing when we do this kind of trip. This girl went to India and she had some very nice experience there. The meditation was very nice and peaceful, a lot of joy and happiness when she went. But then when she came back, of course, that disappeared because it was a function of going to India. That's why she felt this happiness and this uplift inside her. She came back again to her home country and she lost that feeling. And then she went on a trip to Thailand and she met some of these famous Thai monks. And she asked one of these Thai monks, well, when I went to India, I was feeling so happy and so elated and everything was so good. But now, I don't feel it anymore. And this Thai monk said something like, well, what do you expect? Happiness comes and goes. This is the way life is. You cannot expect that happiness to be there all the time. And there's no point in just going back to India again and experiencing it again. Because if you were to go back to India and you were maybe to stay at Bodh Gaya for 3 months, well, soon enough, that happiness would disappear completely, and you would probably get really negative about Bodh Gaya. You get completely angry and upset because of all the suffering, all the problems of being in India, all the beggars, all the problems around you. The inspiration would fade, and all the problems would remain, and it would just be terrible. You would get really negative about it. Life is like this. It goes up and down. Happiness comes, happiness disappears. We all know how these things are in life. So don't hold on to that happiness. Don't try to grasp the happiness you attain in India. Allow it to go. And instead, the right way of using it is allow it to be a background thing in your mind which pushes you forward. And now and again, reflect on it to allow a little bit of happiness and peace to come up in you. Don't cling to it. Don't think that if you were just staying in India, you could have this happiness like always there. That is the wrong way of looking at it. It's very understandable, but it doesn't work. We cannot hold on to these kind of things. So that is just some of the experiences. I didn't actually say much about my own travel to India, because it might not be maybe that relevant to the exact things which I saw when I was there and what happened. But these are some of the things to reflect on about the pilgrimage to India. And if you haven't been on a pilgrimage, but you consider yourself that this might be inspiring and interesting, I would recommend very much trying to do it at one stage in your life. There are lots of groups from everywhere going. There's always a possibility if you want to go. If you feel like you're not yet committed enough as a Buddhist, then wait till you feel ready for this sort of thing. But it can have a very positive impact. Okay. Any questions or comments? Anything any people want to say about this? That is all I have to say here. How many people here have actually been to India? Well, it's quite a few actually. Okay, good. There's still potential for more though. So.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
Is there a certain sequence in the places we need to visit?
There is no sequence. You can do whatever sequence you like. It doesn't really matter. And not only that, not only isn't there a certain sequence, but very often people actually go to more places than just the 4 holy places. Often people also go to the places where the Buddha stayed. There are some places actually which are very, very beautiful. One of my favorite places, a place called, I mentioned this before in my talk, Rajagaha. It's a place called Vulture's Peak. It's a very, very beautiful place in India. It's very quiet, it's very secluded. There is, if you go at the right time, there's not many people there either. And there's a sense of aloofness. There's no city, there's just bush and things all the way around you. And this is very difficult to find at the other Buddhist holy places because there's always lots of people around. So not only is it nice to go to the 4 holy places, but I would recommend also going to some of those other places, which can also be very, very inspiring. There's another thing about actually going on pilgrimage, which maybe I should mention, which I forgot to say in my talk. And one of the nice things about going on pilgrimage is that if you go, you often go with a monk, and hopefully a senior monk, somebody who has a good understanding of the places and the Dhamma and all these things. And usually you get like Dhamma discourses, like every day. Wherever you go somewhere, we talk about Dhamma, and we have Dhamma discussions basically the whole trip. It's a great way of immersing yourself in the Dhamma much more deeply. Not only do you get the inspiration of the places, but you get like continuous Dhamma input. And it's really marvelous. On my trip, we were talking Dhamma all the time. There was no end to it. I think I was talking 5 or 6 hours a day. I had a sore throat at the end of the day. I feel all my talking. People were giving me dollars all the time to keep my throat going, which was very kind of them, by the way. They really looked after me very, very well there. So, and this is great because when you have that continuous impact of Dhamma, you have a lot of possibilities of asking questions, getting answers. And you can always, when you ask one question, very often another question comes up, right? It's like you always have to sort of keep threading this ball of thread. It's almost like if you start to run out, something more happens. There's never an end. There is an end maybe, but there is a lot of questions that people often have in Buddhism. And this is an incredible chance to ask questions, a lot of them, good questions, and get a much more profound understanding of Buddhism as well. That's one of the beautiful things about going on pilgrimage, is intensity of the Dhamma, which normally very, very few people have in their daily lives. It's a great opportunity to get much deeper into the Dhamma and understand it. Does that answer your question? Tony, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, yeah. Yes, Inslee.
I'd like to mention that when we were on pilgrimage, the place where I was very emotionally affected was in an unusual place, which was a museum in Delhi, where the relics of the Buddha are kept.
Okay. That's a very good point. I think that's a very important thing to point out, actually. That in India now, there is, in the Delhi Museum, is probably the only place in the world where there are relics of the Buddha, which almost with absolute certainty are the real relics of the Buddha. We often hear about relics of the Buddha, we can see relics of the Buddha on shrines everywhere, but very often we have no idea where those relics come from, whether they are real relics or not. Some of them may be, some of them may not be. Basically we have To be honest, we haven't got a clue basically where they came from. But the relics which are in the museum in Delhi, and possibly also some which are found in the museum in Patna in India, these were discovered quite recently, only about 100 years ago. And the way the discovery happened is such that it seems extremely likely that these are real bone fragments from the Buddha himself. And that is remarkable because there's a lot of historical certainty there. And the reason why this is so certain, I can maybe tell you the story briefly, is because after the Buddha passed away, the relics of the Buddha from the funeral pyre were divided into 8. This is what it said historically. Ashoka later on also confirms that. He actually dug up those particular stupas. A stupa is like a burial mound, which also often contains bricks. It's one of these big Buddhist structures which we find all over the world, these stupas. And after these stupas had been divided into 8 parts, all the main tribes of India at the time who were Buddhists got 1 part each, and each of these tribes built a stupa to put those relics inside it. And one particular of those stupas, those kingdoms, were the Sakyans. This was the clan of the Buddha himself. Soon after the Buddha died, that second kingdom was sacked by the Kosalans, and it went back to the jungle. And it was basically just a jungle place for 2,300 years until it was discovered by a British archaeologist about 110 years ago, roughly. And they were dug out of the ground. He found the stupa, a small, very simple stupa, but that's what they were in those days. He dug out this little casket or whatever it was, and on that casket it says the remains of the Buddha. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. And he dug them out of the ground, and then of course after that these became very, very famous relics because of that, and they are now kept in the museum in Delhi. The king of Thailand was a very devout Buddhist, made a special kind of casement for these things because they are obviously so precious. And there's even now an exhibition, I went to an exhibition in Singapore as well called the Nalanda Trail, which basically was an exhibition, Buddhist statues, and they had also obtained some of those bone fragments from the museum in Delhi to show on display there. So this is very powerful. Here you're actually seeing the real remains of the Buddha. So that's a very good point. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Thanks. Anybody else want to say anything there? Any more questions there? Okay, yeah.